So on Christmas Eve, I was just so touched by the Holy Family. Not like the real Mary and Joseph or even a little pageant up here, but the Holy Family up on the Zoom screen. And I can see now Brianna, Chip was home, he didn't have to work that morning, and Lola, little 1.5-year-old on her lap, and Brother Ben, the 5-year-old somewhere else. There were other Holy Families, Camille and Jill and little Cece, and later on I saw the Dickies, and I saw Jennifer and Cecilia from across the way. But from where I was sitting and the way the screen was located, Brianna and Chip and little Lola, it just popped. And I have to say, like, it was one of those moments where I just thought, oh my gosh, how hard the last 2 years have been on parents with little kids. You know, to think about little Lola born 2 months into the epidemic, into the pandemic, and then, you know, going back to work as a librarian in a school, and Chip working and trying to keep it going, and they're super cautious, trying to keep the kids safe, and just the respect I have. It's like my heart just leaps out, you know, for a sense of wonder at what people are doing, really the families around, what they're going through, and just the deep sense of respect. I have that sense of respect for all people, you know, especially our little families at peace, you know, when they visit at the start, I'm like, you know, we don't have a building, we don't have a traditional Sunday school program, we don't have that, whatever. And they come back because they're like, we want to raise our kids in a community like this. You know, a community that's open-hearted and open-minded, with hands and arms wide open, trying to grow in acceptance and tolerance, trying to be a source of peace and justice. And you see that and you just think, oh my gosh, what a blessing. And that's exactly what's going on in this gospel passage. The Holy Family are tipping us off right here about what's important and how you raise a child up. We're told, you know, Jesus is going to grow in wisdom and stature. And that Jesus has grown in wisdom and stature. And in between that, we're told as parents, every year, take the Passover ritual and go to Jerusalem and take their kids with them, right? Those rituals and those traditions, that's how we raise our kids up. That's how we raise one another up, right? It's going to church, it's saying our prayer over the meal and in the morning shower and the bedtime, and it's going on the march and the rally. My kids, I don't think they grew up having any distinction really between going to church and then going to the rally to stop the war in Iraq. I mean, they saw the same people and they brushed up against them and they understood it was all the same thing. And that's part of the rituals here and the customs and the traditions. It's not just the things we do, it is also the people that we brush up against, right? I mean, the people who we see all the time who call us to live with more faith and more passion, and who inspire us. So that's a big part of what's going on here, is this call and this reminder that, you know, to be a person of faith and to learn and to grow in stature and wisdom, attend to the things you do every day and pay attention to who you hang around with, because it's going to shape you. Jesus kind of mixing it up with the leaders in the synagogue, right? It's who he was learning from and exchanging with. But then there's something else that happens in this passage. He gets lost, right? And his parents can't find him. And that's also a theme in the Gospel of Luke, is things being lost. You know, we're going to hear in a few months, you know, the lost coin, and then the lost sheep, and then the worst thing of all, the lost child, right? The one who somehow has gone off and away, and who is just not where and not in what he wants us to be. And that's kind of an interesting word too, because it's a reminder that guess how much control we have? Yeah, not a lot, right? Not just like on how our kids turn out, or how we turn out, or how the day does, or you can wear that mask every single day and take every single precaution, and then somehow there you are on the way to the airport and the test comes back positive, right? I mean, there's just only so much control. And sometimes, you know, things really go off kilter. And we saw that this year, and we're going to be reminded of it a lot in the next week and a half in the Capitol riots. Speaking of things being out of our control, here we go. But welcome to Life in the Gritty Sanctuary. But no, I looked at that screen with the same sense of disbelief that I had looking at the Finley family on January 6th in the TV, you know, with Joe standing there, but not that sense of wonder and respect, but like, what is going on? I mean, it was just such a frightening image, seeing that crush of crowd, almost all men, almost all white, you know, it was just the most frightening thing, right? And it wasn't just a sense of how can people believe this? How can they be this deluded? How can they be disillusioned? How can they be this isolated? Where's this violence and rage and anger and just, I mean, that was just one of the most difficult moments and kind of a sign, again, of how, whether it's the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or QAnon, you know, the rituals and the traditions and the people you're around and the things you get going into, they start shaping you, right? And it's really hard to break into that and kind of put that away. And I think the last few months have really opened our eyes to the power of that, you know, just to, you know, that you can't just assume that the things people say and the things they teach one another and the things they invite one another into won't shape people in really amazing ways to then go and do really reprehensible things. About that same time, I heard another story, a story that has just come to me over and over and over and challenged me and fed me. It was not long after I saw the movie One Night in Miami. Probably some of you saw it. You know, it was kind of the fictional account of something, a true event, the night in February of 1964 when Cassius Clay, who was going to be Muhammad Ali, won the heavyweight boxing title. And he spent that evening with friends, with Malcolm X, with the singer Sam Cooke, and with the football player Jim Brown. And shortly after that, the Dallas Morning News ran a story about the day that Jim Brown came to Texas and played in the Cotton Bowl in 1957. Jim Brown played for Syracuse at the time, college. And my mom and dad were at that football game. And I have heard my dad talk about that day in 1957 when TCU beat Syracuse 28-27 in the Cotton Bowl, and Jim Brown was the most valuable player. And my dad can still tell you the score at the end of every quarter, you know, and how that game went down. But the story in the Dallas Morning News was not about Jim Brown on the field. It was about the death threats that he had faced as the second black player who had come to the Cotton Bowl to play. And it talked about how the FBI were outside of his room trying to keep him safe. And it went into a lot of detail. And so later on, I was talking to my dad about it. And I said, I wonder when the first black player came to the Cotton Bowl. I guess it must have been, you know, 56 or 55. And my dad said, no, it was 48. He said it was 1948. I think it was Penn State. I think they brought two black players. I'm like, first of all, it couldn't have been 9 years before between the first and the second. And you're 90, well, you probably just don't. Sure enough, 1948, Penn State brought two black players to the Cotton Bowl. And that's an interesting story because there was a player named Wally Triplett and a player named Dennis Hogard who played for Penn State. Wally Triplett was a young African-American man. He grew up in Pennsylvania. His father was a postal worker, which, as you know, government jobs have been sort of a step into the middle class for African-Americans. So because of his address, University of Miami, which was of course very segregated, assumed he was a white high school player. This was back in the day, obviously, before people had a lot of scouts and TV to watch and all that. So they offered Wally Triplett a scholarship to University of Miami. And Triplett had to tell him, well, I'm a black guy. So then they said, well, yeah, of course you're not coming. So he went to Penn State and played football. The next year, 1946, the last game, Penn State was supposed to play University of Miami, in Miami. And obviously, you know, Wally Triplett and Dennis Hogard were concerned because they knew they weren't going to be making the trip. Well, the football team for Penn State got together, not the alums, not the coaches, not the administration, and the players got together and they took a vote and they said, we're not going. So they canceled that game, which is a pretty big deal at the time because Penn State was just becoming a football powerhouse. This was a step to be able to go to this really important thing. Well, the very next year, they got the invitation. Now Penn State's fourth in the country, and they get the invitation to play the third most, number 3 team, SMU, at the Cotton Bowl. And again, Steve Suey, who was the captain of the Penn State team, they got together, they took a vote, and they said, we're not going. And then Steve Suey said to the public, this is the last time we're having a meeting like this, we're not going. We play all or we play none. We are Penn State. And that's kind of supposedly where the iconic, we are Penn State, we are Penn State. But it was a way of saying, this is who we are, right? These guys who somehow grew in wisdom and stature. Now, again, we don't have film clips and all the stuff that we have now, but when the sports writers write about that day, one thing they mention is that those players, Penn State, older than normal. They didn't go straight from high school into college. They went from high school to World War II. And they saw a lot of stuff there, right? They went over there to what? Push back against Hitler and fascism, to free, to liberate. And you came back, and it was a little harder to look away from Jim Crow, a little harder to look away from the truth of this country. In the end, Penn State made that trip down to Dallas. But some credit has to go to the coach, Matty Bell at SMU. By the way, when they went, they couldn't stay in Dallas, which was segregated. They had to stay 14 miles away at a naval air base, and they had to practice there. They didn't have their best game, but probably that had something to do with it. Matty Bell was the coach at SMU. He's kind of a storied name in Texas football. He coached at A&M and TCU and SMU in the 20s and 30s, 40s. When he was the football coach at SMU, he was also the basketball coach, which tells you things are done a little bit differently now, right? But he coached at SMU from 35 to 41, and then he took a break to go serve in the Navy, to be a naval officer. Then he came back in 45 and kept coaching there till like 50 or so. But when the Cotton Bowl officials had said, yeah, no black kids coming down here, Matty Bell, who was a churchgoer and who believed in integration, said, we don't have any problem playing against black players. After all, isn't this a democracy? Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, and isn't that what we want for ourselves? The scripture doesn't let us linger very long over the baby Jesus before it calls us to live and to walk like Jesus, to reach out, to march, to make a difference, to spread our arms wide, to say God's peace, God's justice, God's bounty, God's blessing, it will be for one and all. May this day, the rituals, the community, the people we gather with encourage us to keep growing in God's favor. Amen.